there's a lot of goals that are in contradiction with one another when you hear how the Trump administration, the incoming Trump administration, talks about trade and tax policy. And getting all of those arrows to point in the same direction, the right direction, would be a lot more fruitful.
Hello. Welcome again to the episode in the Let People Prosper show. My name is Dr. Vance Ginn. I hope you're having a prosperous day. Well, today I'm delighted to bring on a guest who knows a lot about taxes and tariffs and trade and economics and a whole bunch more. And it's none other than Erica York. Erica, welcome to the Let People Prosper show.
Hey, Vance. Thanks for having me on.
It's a pleasure to have you on. I'm looking forward to our discussion today, right in the new year. We're actually recording this before the new year, so if anything comes up, sorry we missed it, but we're trying to cover as much as we can as we get into this. But before we get going too far, let me go ahead and read your bio for the audience. So, Erica York is Senior Economist and Research Director with the Tax Foundation Center for Federal Tax Policy. She previously worked as an auditor at a large community bank in Kansas and interned at Tax Foundation's Center for State Tax Policy. Her analysis has been featured in the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, Politico, and many other outlets. She holds a master's degree in economics from Wichita State University and an undergraduate degree in business administration and economics from Sterling College, where she is currently an adjunct professor. Erica lives in Kansas with her husband and their 2 children. So, with all that great stuff going on, Erica, let me go ahead and ask you the first question I do all the guests. Why do you do what you do every day?
Yeah, so the reason I work in the field that I do goes back to a high school teacher I had, economics teacher. He made us read like The Law by Bastiat, talked to us about all the good things that I'm sure your listeners know, and that inspired me to get into the field of economics. Didn't know what I wanted to do with that, but I'm from the state of Kansas, and we had a really big tax reform experiment back when I was in school, and so that got me interested in taxes. I stumbled upon the Tax Foundation because of that, got my internship there, absolutely loved it, and knew I wanted to work at TF full time when I was done with school. And fortunately, that worked out, and I've been with TF for 7 years now.
Wow! Time flies, right?
It does.
Yeah, and that little thing in Kansas, that was the Kansas experiment that you mentioned, where they cut taxes, Sam Brownback, and then they came back a couple of years later running deficits, and then raised taxes again, and then everybody poo-pooed on it and said, this is why you don't cut taxes. And, I think what we've learned from that, right, is that you also got to focus on spending too. Spending is kind of a problem here. But what were some of the lessons that you learned from that?
Yeah, I think the design of your tax cut matters. If you have very big differentials in the way you treat different types of income, then you're going to get a lot of people who want to game that. And so you have to be careful about the incentives that you may be unintentionally creating when you do a big change to the tax system.
Definitely. Well, incentives matter. I say that all the time on the show, as you might expect. But they really do. And so this is just another example of that. But I wonder, is there a particular reason why you chose, economics as a major and kind of got into that area? For me, it was something that, in 2001, I was a freshman in college, and we had 9/11 happen and everything, and I'd already studied some economics. I went to homeschool from 7th grade through 12th grade, and so we had economics as one of the classes. And I remember in my microeconomics class, my economics professor was like, well, I guess now that we'll have a war, and then that will stimulate the economy and everything else. And I was like, oh, that doesn't make any sense. How does that work? And so I, learning Bastiat later, but you mentioned, kind of the seen versus the unseen. And I was understanding that early on, and it really got me into the game. And I read Milton Friedman and all that. But what got you going, Erica?
Yeah, it's really fascinating. And it does go back to that high school teacher. And then one of my professors in college, he would always start class with every decision you make is an economic decision. Huh. Who decided to brush their teeth this morning? Who decided to eat breakfast? And he'd explain how that was an economic decision. And to me, that was just fascinating, because when you study economics, you're really studying human behavior and the interactions we all have with each other. And it kind of puts science and math in combination with that. And I just am really passionate about that myself and find it very fulfilling. So I think that's what drew me toward the field.
Awesome. Awesome. And then you've already talked about the Kansas tax situation, kind of got you on that route for studying taxes. And, there are so many different issues going on with taxes. And when you first started off at TF, at least as an intern, you were working on state tax policy, which is a lot of the work that I do. And then you got into federal tax policy, which I've done some of that as well. But it's interesting to look at those, connections and everything else. And I guess, as we're getting into this discussion, where are kind of your assumptions? Like, do you have, key assumptions in your mind, thinking about tax policy or economics in general? I kind of come at it from a classical liberal, more libertarian angle. You just throwing my cards on the table. But I wonder kind of from your perspective, what do you look at it from?
Yeah, probably pretty similar, really. Like some of the big picture principles that I keep in mind are, people have different values and they value things differently. People respond to incentives. And when it comes to taxes, we have a lot of evidence that the tax system does change incentives for people, whether we're talking about their incentives to save, their incentives to work. That could be how much they work, what field they work in, whether they join the labor force at all. And then, of course, how much businesses invest. And so broadly, it's that idea of incentives. How are people going to respond to those changes, incentives? And what does that mean for the broader economy too?
Yeah, definitely. And incentives, we see that every day as well, one day to the next. And I'm always talking about incentives and institutions, the importance of institutions as well. And, I draw a lot of my thought on a combination of schools of economics, if you will, with the Austrian school, Chicago school, public choice, and institutional economics, Douglas North, and what Peter Boettke calls the mainline economics versus mainstream economics. And I think it helps tell a little bit more about our world. I mean, to me, economics is fascinating because, to your point earlier, we're always making these economic decisions, marginal costs versus marginal benefits. We may not even be thinking about it. I know when I taught economics, I said something, very similar, is that everybody's thinking like an economist. They just don't know it yet. And so I think it's pretty fascinating, the things that we're able to study and look at and everything else. And in your career so far, what are some of the key highlights that have really been something that you've not only enjoyed doing, but have had a huge impact maybe on public policy or defining the narrative of what's going on? What are some of the key things? And then before we jump into some of the more specific policy initiatives that have been talked about recently.
Yeah, I'll give a recent example.
Okay.
So we did a lot of analysis of the candidate tax plans in the run up to the election, and we actually had both major campaigns cite our analysis. So the Harris campaign cited some of our work on tariffs, and the Trump campaign cited some of our work on the TCJ expirations, and that just really. It's cool to see it at that level. So your work cited at that level, but that both campaigns cited it just helps show that the objective analysis that I think we're doing at TF, that it doesn't matter what party you're in, you trust the numbers that we're producing. So I think that's been a very big highlight for me recently.
Yeah, that's awesome to have both candidates mentioning you. I mean, that's fantastic. Tell us a little bit about Tax Foundation for those who don't know. I mean, it's a great group out of DC, working a lot on tax policy. But how do you like to explain what TF does?
Yeah, so we're a nonprofit. We're a 501c3. We're nonpartisan, and we analyze tax policy at all levels of government. So we've got a Center for State Tax Policy that looks at state and some local policies. We've got our federal tax team, and we've got a global tax team. And we recently opened up an office in Brussels to dive into more EU-focused tax policy.
Wow.
We've been growing a lot,
Yeah.
and there's tax policy happening everywhere. So it's good that we get to be part of that conversation. But we approach tax policy from 4 principles. We think the tax system should be simple, neutral, transparent, and stable. And so we apply those principles consistently. We've been around since 1937, actually, and have always had that consistent message. One of the other things that sets us apart on the federal team is that we have our own in-house macroeconomic model that lets us not just do revenue estimates of tax policy changes, but also estimate how they'll, impact wages, jobs, investment, and overall economic output.
Yeah, fantastic. And there's always a lot of good things for folks to look at. And what y'all do a great job too, you, Eric, and others that are there, is breaking things down to where people can understand it. and great charts and everything else. So for the audience, if you don't know about Tax Foundation yet, go check them out. I know probably many of you already do, but there's always a lot of good resources that are available. So, I think with all of that, let's jump into some of the key things. And I think, why not go ahead and start with the most controversial one that's talked about all the time? Maybe not necessarily controversial with us, but with the external thing, especially within the presidential debate, and now with the Trump administration coming in. And I should mention that I was in the Trump administration the first time around as chief economist of OMB, and I pushed back a lot on tariffs. That's what I want to talk about then. But now, it looks like we're not only doubling down, which as you've noted, under the Trump administration, yes, we had the tariffs, but the Biden administration kept most of those in, and the amount of tariff revenue, tax collections coming in that way, almost, I think it was either doubled or tripled during the Biden administration. So it's not like this has went away, but now there's been renewed discussion by incoming President Trump, President-elect Trump, if you will, on adding more to tariffs, whether it be on China or across the board, 10%, 25%. I don't know. It keeps changing. Now we just recently heard about tariffs on Mexico and Canada. I thought USMCA fixed all that. I guess not. But where do you like to start, Erica, when you're talking about tariffs? Because I think for many people and my friends and family and others, even the more conservative folks would say, well, you know what? Tariffs are a good tool to bring people to the negotiating table. And China, I mean, they have terrible trade policies. They're not playing by the rules of the game. So why shouldn't we go after them? But where do you like to start with tariffs?
I like to start just by reminding people that they're a tax.
Yeah.
And, the average person probably hasn't heard about tariffs since their high school history class talking about Smoot-Hawley, and that's forever ago. So, tariffs are a tax. They're a tax that's paid by the business or the person doing the importing. They're not paid by a foreign country or a foreign government or a foreign business. And they have the effect of raising the price of the goods that are being tariffed. Now, the whole point of that is to discourage people from buying foreign goods and encourage them to buy domestically produced goods. But doing that has a cost. And that cost is that higher price. And that cost is protecting businesses that are relatively less efficient. They wouldn't be getting that business if it were not for the tariff. So the tariff is shielding them from this foreign competition, and it's filtering business, reallocating business towards higher cost producers. So that means overall efficiency in our economy drops. And that cost is imposed, broadly. So it's spread out, it's diffused across American consumers, which may be, retail consumers if it's something we're buying on the shelf at Walmart, or it could be business consumers if we're talking about things like steel and aluminum, raises the cost for US manufacturers to do business here. So just getting the very basic mechanics of tariffs. Then on the question, is China a good trading partner? The answer is no. There are obviously abuses happening with trade rules, with labor, all sorts of problems. But it's not clear that the U.S. going it alone, imposing tariffs on China is going to change that behavior. It didn't change it from 2018, 2019. So we have tariffs in place. U.S. importers are paying those. U.S. consumers are paying higher costs. We've seen a negative impact on our economy from that. China retaliated, put tariffs on a lot of U.S. exports, including agricultural commodities. They still have a tariff on U.S. pork exports. So that has hurt the ag community, their ability to sell into China.
Yeah.
And China has continued and even gotten more aggressive in some of its unfair trade practices. So absolutely agree that there's a problem, but I think I would disagree that tariffs are the solution to that problem.
Yeah, I agree with you. I wonder too, we hear a lot of this, I call it noise, but there are some arguments out there that says that the Rust Belt was hollowed out by trade and that they all went to China. And so if we just had these tariffs and we transformed and didn't have trade deficits. The other thing is big is about trade deficits, which I don't usually like talking about trade deficits. I like talking about trade volume because we have interactions between Americans and Chinese or Americans and Mexicans. It's not America and China. Countries can't trade. People do. And they're satisfying their desires when they make those trades, and it's helping out those that are here and elsewhere. Now, the problem can become whenever you talk about communist China, and a lot of it's going to rent seekers and the government. That's a problem. But at least those individuals are benefiting from that process. But I wonder, like, what you think about the idea of hollowing out of the Rust Belt, and because my usually retort here is, and I'd love to see what you think, is the manufacturing sector had a lot of automation. There was increases in innovation. There were other things that were going on that started to push people away from more employment in manufacturing. However, manufacturing output is still reaching record levels. It's just that the employment numbers are going down. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I think one is automation. I think state policy also pushed a lot of people out of those manufacturing states into Sun Belt states like Texas and other places. And that also that higher cost pushed them out of the country to other countries. But I wonder, do you agree with that? Or do you think that there's some other things at play?
Yeah, Bradley, I agree with what you laid out. So there's a lot of confusion in the debate over manufacturing because people conflate manufacturing employment with manufacturing output, like you mentioned. If you look at trends in manufacturing employment as a share of total employment has been on the decline for decades. It predates China's ascension to the WTO, predates NAFTA, all of these things. And it's true across all advanced economies too. Yeah. And this is just the path of development that countries follow, right? When you start out, most of your workers are employed in agriculture. As you get gains in agriculture, they shift to manufacturing. So you have a greater share in manufacturing than you used to in agriculture. And then as you develop and become more productive, you have higher use of technology. Now we have the automation factor as well. You see a declining share of manufacturing employment and it moves to services. This is both because of automation and it's because of consumer preferences. Mm-hmm. If you look at where consumers are spending their money, when you become more affluent, you don't just like buy bigger and bigger refrigerators and like more and more, durable goods to put in your home. There's a limit to that. And a lot of our additional spending goes toward the service sector. And so we see employment in the service sector expand. So I think there's a very clear path that is not trade policy driven when it comes to those broader trends in employment. When we look at manufacturing output, like you mentioned, that has still continued to grow. And that's a testament to the productivity of American workers. Yeah. I think you can look at, is productivity growing enough? There are policy changes you can adopt there when it comes to tax reform, regulatory reform, but it's not really a trade policy issue.
Yeah. Good points there. I agree with you. And I wonder too, what have we seen since we've been imposing tariffs? There's always low-level tariffs before Trump came in, but not a lot. I mean, that really boosted it up starting in 2017. You mentioned this briefly earlier, how it didn't seem to work. What do you mean by that? Because I think what most people think is like, well, surely that helped to reduce the trade deficit and China is going to change some of their trade practices. But did we really, are we bringing back manufacturing jobs? Do we see any of that?
Yeah, so no, and no. Yeah. On the trade deficit question, the trade deficit's a reflection of broader macro trends. We in the United States invest a lot more than we save, and so we require capital inflows from the rest of the world to make up that gap between our domestic saving and our investment opportunities. Mm-hmm. The reason we don't save a lot, you can look at the federal government budget deficit. That's very large. You can also look at, savings rates of people. We have a tax bias against saving because we double tax income that is saved to be consumed later. So that discourages saving. But that gap is made up by foreign investors, whether that's foreign direct investment, whether it's purchasing US treasuries. So we have this capital inflow on the one side that necessitates the opposite relationship in our trade balance, where we import more goods and we send more dollars abroad than we are exporting. And so if you want to change that trade balance, what you have to look at is domestic saving.
Yeah.
And, there are also factors like the US dollar being the global reserve currency that pushes the trade balance further than it would be in the absence of that factor. But the big issue is that gap between saving and investment.
Yeah.
And so tariffs don't fundamentally alter that because they're not fundamentally altering domestic saving. And so we did not see a change in the overall balance of trade. Tariffs can divert where bilateral trade balances are. So when we put higher tariffs on China, we imported less from China, but we made up for that by importing more from Taiwan and South Korea and Mexico and virtually every other country. So the overall balance didn't change. If we look at the manufacturing question, manufacturing employment actually decreased because of the tariffs. And if we look at what we were imposing tariffs on, that really makes sense. More than half of what we import are intermediate goods and capital goods, so things that domestic businesses use in their own production process. And if we looked at what the tariffs on China applied to, it was primarily those intermediate inputs and capital goods. And so that directly raises input costs for US firms. When you combine that with foreign retaliation against US exports, you get a dominating effect of decreased manufacturing jobs, even though you may have protected a few sectors that, make those parts and materials in the United States. They don't expand enough to make up for all of those downstream losses.
Yeah. All right. Fantastic. And how much are we importing now?
About a little over $3 trillion worth of goods. It's like 11% of GDP.
Yeah. Okay. And so, so $3 trillion, pretty massive amount. And you said about half, which I've read that as well, about half is intermediate goods. So we're talking about maybe $1.5 trillion of that are just intermediate goods, right?
Yeah. And that's excluding the auto parts sector too. So if you add that, then you get up like closer to 60%.
Wow.
Or maybe even a little higher when you include all auto trade.
Yeah. Because I think a lot of people think about these are just final goods that we're importing and that we're consuming, but a lot of it's actually from businesses importing the parts that go into whatever they're producing to make the final good later, which of course can compound. If you get a higher tariff, a higher cost, then you pass along that cost, or you don't hire as many people, you cut production somehow. I mean, nothing is free. There are going to be trade-offs here, and these aren't good trade-offs along the way, I don't think. And it's also something, to your point earlier, I think it was a great one, is that consumers' preferences are such that they also want to buy cheaper things over time. And a lot of things that we import from China has substantially benefited those of lower income, lower skills that otherwise we have to pay a lot more, it'd have a much higher cost, and many of them may not be as profitable or as prosperous as they are today. And so I think it's something without looking at the full effect of what these trade policies are doing. I mean, when you take a step back though, Erica, I think about, Alexander Hamilton was really in favor of tariffs. And for a long time, for, 100 plus years, we were dominated by tariffs, and there's the revenue that was coming in to pay for the spending. And so now there's been this discussion recently where Trump and some others have said, well, what if we eliminate income taxes and replace it with tariffs, And I think, I have problems with that, but let's say it sounds good in theory, and we could go back to that. I mean, if we only bring in $3 trillion of imports today, and we had 100% tax, and say every dollar we're going to bring in tax revenue, that's $3 trillion, but we're spending $6.6 trillion. So we would be running deficits. We continue to run deficits. And if you have 100% tax, no one's going to import at all. So you're also not going to bring in the tax revenue either. And so I just don't think this is a good idea. And even if we had it back during Alexander Hamilton and others, I still don't think it was the best way to tax even then. But I wonder what your thoughts are as you've been digging into this literature and everything for a while. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so the United States did rely on tariffs as their main source of revenue for a long time, and that was primarily because of the administrative simplicity of it. You have a
Mm,
couple of ports, you have a very easy way to collect the revenue because the stuff can't come in unless you collect the revenue. There was no system to tax income or
mm,
to tax other internal transactions at the time, and they needed the money to pay off war debt. So it was
hmm.
kind of like here's what we're going to do. And if you look throughout, American history, there's always been a really great debate over the tariffs. Do we want a tariff for revenue or do we want a tariff for protection?
Hmm.
And Hamilton is often called a protectionist, and you hear about the American system and Henry Clay. And
Hmm.
if you look a little closer, though, I think there's like, yes, he was a protectionist, but there's more nuance to the story than that.
Yeah, yeah.
Hamilton's main concern as Treasury Secretary was being able to manage the federal debt. And
Hmm.
if you have such high protectionist tariffs that you completely discourage imports, you don't get to raise revenue, and that puts the federal debt in jeopardy. And so if you look at Hamilton's primary concern, it was having a stable source of revenue, not wanting to discourage imports so much that you lose that revenue source. And so I think that was his primary motivation, though secondarily there were motivations to try to grow infant industries and things of that nature.
Yeah.
You also hear that the tariff is the sole cause for American industrialization,
Mm.
and I think there's a lot of reason to be skeptical of that too.
Yeah.
I'd point to the work of Douglas Irwin,
Yeah.
who's written books and papers galore on this, and his work is excellent. And he cites many other economists and economic historians who've looked at the period and found that no, tariffs really don't explain industrialization. If you, sorry, let me close out of this and I'll start back up on there.
All right.
Okay.
I'll cut this later. I marked
Yeah,
it.
thanks.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Okay. Tariffs really don't explain American industrialization. If anything, they probably had somewhat of a negative impact by increasing the cost of capital goods.
Mm.
And it's land, it's resources, it's labor force growth, immigration that explain the bulk of the growth that we saw in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And so, yes, the tariff has been part of American history, but its story in creating American success is worth a lot of skepticism. And the big reason we had tariffs in the beginning was for revenue purposes, not for protection.
Yeah, great points there. And it's good to learn the history of where we've been and to understand what we need to do now and maybe not do in the future. And to your point, I mean, I think trying to say that a tariff or any sort of tax is the reason why we had the industrial growth that we did, I mean, is counterintuitive to me. I mean, government is there to preserve liberty, and I believe in limited roles for government, but it's not there to foster more economic growth. I mean, I think that it's oftentimes a hindrance. I mean, raising a tax on something like a tariff, you're reducing economic opportunity, economic activity that otherwise would take place. So how would that contribute to more economic growth in the process? So I love the way that you lay that out there, and I'm hopeful that some of those who are going in the Trump administration now will push back. I'm concerned that they won't because they brought in Peter Navarro again, who's the trade advisor here, and he's big on tariffs and the existential threat that he believes that China is. So he wants to use everything he can to go after them. But I also see this as more of a broader fight. I mean, I don't know why we're trying to put a tariff again on Canada, for example. I mean, I get some of the stuff with Mexico, given the border crossings, the fentanyl, the drug use, but the thing, Erica, that I often get pushback on this is that I don't think we should be using tariffs. I don't think it's a good tool for the negotiating table. I think there are diplomacy. There are other ways to get groups to talk. But if we really want to change trade practices in China and other places, I think we should be having more free trade agreements with our allies. I mean, I think the Trans-Pacific Partnership would have been a great opportunity. I talked about that a lot when I was in the Trump administration, and I got pushback from Navarro and all them a lot, and Lighthizer. But whatever, I think that would have been a good opportunity to put more pressure on China for that. It's not just the trade war with America now, and they're a communist country who I would argue doesn't really care about their people too much. I mean, they need to make sure there's not uprisings, but they're not going to have an election. But however, if you have multiple countries, and there were 12, 13 countries that were part of TPP, many of them in East Asia, Taiwan and others, if you were all having free trade with them, that would put more pressure on China to change their trade practices. And in addition, finding ways to lower the cost of doing business here at home. I mean, I think one reason why, we've pushed so many jobs overseas or manufacturing overseas and other things is because of, high taxes, high spending, high deficits and debt and high regulations. If you start focusing on reducing the cost of doing business here, there would be more incentive for businesses to stay here. What do you think about some of that?
Absolutely. And, whether the goal is we want China to change their trading practices, or maybe the goal is we want to decouple from China in sensitive areas. The answer to both of those is you need an off-ramp for that activity, or you need allies with you to pressure China to change. So it's exactly that, more free trade agreements with like-minded nations so that we can have a trading bloc of those of us who agree, whether that's for off-ramping trade from China or whether it's pressuring China to change its trade practices. So totally agree with you on that. And then, yeah, absolutely. There are a couple of metaphors that you can kind of mix, but so much of the talk on trade is this desire to be inward focused. Just think, U.S. first. But really, a U.S. first perspective would say, what do we need to do to make it more practical to do business here? How can we lower barriers to investment? How can we lower red tape that businesses have to go through? So rather than being inwardly focused and putting up walls, it's what can we do to boost incentives to get government out of the way?
Yeah.
Any tax system you have is going to create a drag on economic growth, but you can minimize that drag. And rather than doing that right now, we're considering things like tariffs that just increase the drag of that system.
Yeah.
So I think, there's a lot of goals that are in contradiction with one another when you hear how the incoming Trump administration talks about trade and tax policy, and getting all of those arrows to point in the same direction, the right direction, would be a lot more fruitful.
Yeah, definitely. I totally agree. Well, speaking of that, we've got a big year coming up here in 2025. We're recording this, like I said, earlier in December, but this is going to go out in January. It's a big year, that we have the CR is going to expire. So there's some spending issues that are going to happen. The debt limit, the debt ceiling is going to be a discussion as well. And then the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that was passed in 2017, some called the Trump tax cuts, the individual marginal rates expire in December of 2025, along with some other things that are out there. The only one that's really permanent, I believe, is really the corporate tax rate cut down to 21%. There's some discussion about moving that to 15%. But this is also going to be a huge drag because of the uncertainty that is going to be across the economy in 2025. I think there's going to be a lot of a drag on that, along with if we don't get our spending in order, our fiscal house in order, if you will, we're going to have higher interest rates and potentially higher inflation. We just had a report on CPI which shows that it's coming back up again in November, which is concerning to me, and I'm hopeful that the Trump administration, the two big things that I have concerns about are excessive spending, because the president didn't want to do much on spending the first term. We tried, like with Russ Vought and others who I believe are fiscal hawks. We tried to cut spending. We had $4.6 trillion in savings over a decade in the last budget, but the president really didn't care. So he didn't announce it or talk about it much at all. And then of course the tariffs and protectionism, I think, will also be a big drag. But I wonder with something like, the DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, it's external. Maybe it won't be able to do a lot, but maybe it'll give us some ideas of where to cut. Although the GAO also has a lot of those, by the way. So Erica, with all that stuff going on and looking at 2025, what are you hoping we see here in 2025?
Yeah, the best case scenario would be that the expiration of the 2017 tax cuts inspires Congress to go back to the drawing board, maybe go back to earlier versions of the 2017 tax law and take a shot at fundamental tax reform. So the 2017 law made significant strides in simplifying the system and increasing incentives for work, for investment, but it didn't go all the way towards like a fundamental tax reform that would move towards a consumption tax type of system.
Yeah.
And so this would be an opportunity to do that. It would also be an opportunity to expand from just tax reform to fiscal reform, look at both sides of the budget. Especially if the Department of Government Efficiency provides the political will to
Right.
do some of these changes. It's not really a mystery what the big drivers of spending growth are. It's not a mystery, like you mentioned, with all of the GAO reports and recommendations we have where efficiencies are possible. It's more a matter of Congress having the guts or the willpower to go through and legislate on that. And so, maybe the stars all align and we do get something great. That's the most optimistic case. But the least optimistic case is that, the revenue implications of just continuing the 2017 expiring provisions are more than $4 trillion in lost revenue over the next decade. Interest rates are higher now than they were in 2017. Baseline deficits are higher now. So that's going to just put a ton of pressure on Congress to do something about that fiscal impact. The worst case scenario would be like budget gimmicks that we see come out, whether that's playing games with what baseline we use to measure the scored cost of a tax policy change, or whether that's something like another temporary extension that just kicks the can down the road, doesn't provide people the certainty they need to make these investment and work decisions, and really would be a missed opportunity. So I'm hopeful it's something more towards the first, where we get more permanent provisions in tax policy paid for either by like smart base broadeners on the tax side or by spending reforms. But there's a lot of uncertainty as to whether that will really happen.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I wonder, there's also going to be a lot of discussion about the SALT tax deduction cap at $10,000 now. And of course, you've got the New Yorks and the Californias and others that have a lot of state and local taxes who are saying, you know what, we don't like this. We want to get rid of that cap. And in my view, I would actually like to see the SALT go away entirely. And that way that there are incentives in place for state and local governments to spend wisely and not overtax their people. And then they get a deduction at the federal level. And so basically it's like subsidizing them to some capacity to even spend and tax more at the state and local level. And I just don't like that idea. And that would bring in more revenue if we did it that way. But what do you think about that?
Absolutely right. Completely getting rid of the SALT deduction would be a really good way to pay for those lower marginal tax rates. You broaden the base, you lower the rate, you make the tax system more efficient. But I don't think that's where the politics will be, especially with such slim margins in the House. That gives those SALT caucus members, if you will, more voice over the process. So I think rather than a $10,000 cap on SALT, we'll probably see a higher cap. How much higher, I don't know. But I don't think it stays at 10K. I think it gets higher, and I think it gets doubled for joint filers too.
Wow. Yeah. All right. Well, we'll see about that. And I wonder too, it'd be nice if we were getting to a flatter income tax. And I wonder if some of the discussion will be not just extending the Trump tax cuts, but actually simplifying it more. I mean, the standard deduction, doubling that, made it much simpler for many people across the country. And I wonder, though, if also we could get to where we could flatten some of these brackets, have fewer number. Ultimately, I'd like to see a flat income tax. But I don't know if that's even on the table or if you've heard much about that yet.
I haven't heard that. I think right now, I think it's mainly trying to figure out how to make the math work for just the TCJA provisions. But I do think if there's a big push from the Trump administration to use tariffs as a pay for, particularly to use like a universal tariff as a pay for, then we could kind of like reopen the playbook and look at, well, rather than mixing, just a continuation of the status quo with a huge new tariff. What if we do something like a flat tax? What if we move towards a consumption tax base that maybe makes both camps happy and removes the the biases against investment and production that are inherent in the income tax moves towards a consumption tax. You can get it flatter. You can address distributional concerns in a number of ways, even if you do move to a consumption tax. And you avoid all of those negative impacts of tariffs that we already talked about.
Yeah.
But again, this would be like one of those like ideal situations.
Yeah.
The political process is probably not going to produce something so nice.
Gotcha. We'll try to keep pushing them where we can. So as we're starting to wrap up here, Erica, it's been a great conversation. I wonder, I'd like to get some of your thoughts about what you're seeing in the states. I know most of your work, of course, is on the federal level, but the states, we've had this flat tax revolution that's been happening. Many states are moving to flat taxes. Louisiana, where I do a lot of work with the Pelican Institute, they just moved to a flat 3% tax. And so I think this is an extraordinary opportunity and hopefully good lessons for the federal government to also learn from, along with spending restraint. As you know, I talk a lot about sustainable budgeting and fiscal rules and everything else that I love to see at the federal level. I don't know when we'll ever get there, if we ever will. Hopefully one day we will. But what are you kind of excited about at the state levels?
I think that the number one policy issue that comes to mind for me for states, especially with the phase out and the expiration of TCJA, is how states are conforming to bonus depreciation. So TCJA temporarily provided 100% deduction for investments in machinery and equipment, but that has been phasing out. And if states are automatically adopting that phase out by bringing that federal definition into their tax system, they're automatically increasing taxes on investment that occurs in their state. And so if they decouple from that phase out of bonus depreciation and instead fix their system to when the federal tax code had 100% bonus depreciation, they will be encouraging investment in their state and ensuring that they're not just automatically bringing in a penalty for capital investment in their state tax code.
Yeah, love it. Well, it's going to be an interesting year. There's so many things going on. Maybe later in the year you can come back on so we can get a recap of where we're at because, you're doing some great work, Erica, and along with the Tax Foundation. Keep up that great work. And I hope you have a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, or did whenever this comes out. But what else would you like to leave us with? Any other thoughts and maybe where best to find you?
Yeah, best place to find me is on Twitter. I'm at Erica D. York. And then, of course, taxfoundation.org is where you can find all of our research. But yeah, we'll be staying on top of whatever it is that Congress ends up doing on tax, as well as what the administration does on tariffs. So I think that the right phrase is buckle up.
Yeah.
I think it's going to be a pretty crazy year.
That's right. Well, I look forward to working with you on some of this, Erica, and keeping the conversation going. So thank you, and God bless you, and keep up the great work.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks, Erica. Well, for the audience, thank y'all for joining us here today. I hope you enjoyed this discussion. If you did, go out and give us a 5-star rating and share it with your friends and family. They need to understand what's happening with tariffs and taxes and all the stuff that we just mentioned here today. Remember, you can go find more information at vanceginn.com or go to my newsletter where you can sign up at vanceginn.substack.com for all the show notes and a lot more. So, God bless you, and until next time, let people prosper.